Today, Disney Sloth is back, so let's get down to business. We are going to talk about Mulan again, and this time we're going to talk about her balance for the second time. The first time I talked about the balance was when we only had her numbers and could only kind of assume things from there, and I already said at that point, don't overestimate her based on the numbers alone, because we have to look at the in-game interactions as well and the delays and everything. And that is what we have now. I have looked into that very thoroughly throughout PTS and have a relatively good impression of all of that I will discuss today to tell you where I think Mulan stands now before she's getting released. I've also talked to Titan Clumsy and shared my thoughts about her balance with him, so basically what I will discuss in this video, and he gave me some further info, what they found in their testing, and also what it currently looks like, where she stands in terms of balance and what they're considering to change or not change. So we'll touch on that here and there. And other than that, let's begin with the balance discussion. One disclaimer that I have to make here is that all the games that I played were on very high ping, 200 plus ping. They were partially against players from EU, partially against players from NA. So some had better ping, some had similar ping or slightly better ping. So there is a factor here where I couldn't really get the feeling of, for example, landing all the abilities as reliably as possible yet. But I could still get a very good idea outside of that, and jungle practice doesn't have that issue anyways. Also, there was one issue on PTS with Mulan that Raging Demon pointed out, which is that the slow on her 2 didn't seem to work correctly, and I looked back at some of my footage, and at least in some situations it doesn't seem to apply. Hyris knows about this now, but we'll have to see how that'll affect her balance if it always applies. And with those disclaimers, precautions, whatever out of the way, let's talk about her strong aspects, her weak aspects, and the in-between, the average things. So one thing that she is very strong at is clearing. This is both in jungle and solo. Especially her 1 has relatively quick, high damage that can hit a full minion wave relatively easily, or at least 5 minions relatively easily, and therefore you will have no issues clearing in solo, and in jungle the damage is definitely sufficient as well. And along with that, you also have the cleave basic attack, and you get an attack speed steroid as well. So all combined, that is just a ridiculous amount of clear in the early game, even though later on it gets even better when you get the 3rd hit. With how fast the animation is, it's also relatively hard for the enemy to interrupt, and there's high risk of them wasting their CC for that, so I think you will rarely see that with most gods. Her team fight is very strong as well. She just has those good AoE capabilities, she has good abilities that help her team in general, and she has good setup as well. She has strong crowd control capabilities. On one hand, she has her 3, which can set up for very nice single kills, very nice individual kills, because you can pull a target towards your team, even though the pull range isn't excessively far. And on the other hand, you have the ultimate, which can literally root an entire team depending on how they're positioned, and also gives you that knockup afterwards, which is not the strongest, longest knockup, but still a very good amount of CC overall in her kit. And assuming the slow would function, you would also have some soft CC on top of that. She generally has high damage output, with the exception of tanks. Here she struggles a little bit more because her cooldowns, outside of one ability that gets her passive effect, are generally relatively long, and her AAs, unless you specifically build into them, are not the strongest, so she's not a tank shredder, but she's also not meant to be one. She also has very strong item synergy, stronger than many other gods, which is why I think this is worth mentioning. For example, she synergizes well with Gladiator's Shield, with Blackthorn Hammer, with Crusher, with Hydra's Lament, or with Heartseeker. You could even make an argument for items like Shield of Regrowth, so there are hardly any items that are actually bad for her. And that brings us to the things that she's average at. I would say overall her sustain is average. It depends a lot on the situation, and if you build Gladiator's Shield, it increases almost exponentially, but the sustain from the 2 alone isn't the greatest, and the fact that Gladiator's Shield is an item that you might want to consider means she has to have external sources to get more sustain. And having tried using her in solo without Gladiator's Shield against Mulan that was using Gladiator's Shield, I would definitely say you should build Gladiator's Shield on her in general. It is an item that she uses well that greatly ups her sustain and laning potential. Her escapes are also average in a way. This is not so much because the escapes in themselves are bad, she has 2 escapes, that's more than most, but rather because of the surrounding factors. The delay on the escapes, the fact that the wall pull escape can only get you to specific positions that are very predictable. It can be body blocked, and it also has to be skilled up first in order to even have that capability. And with the ultimate, you're kind of restricted in when and how you can use it. And I will get to that more in the cons part, because there are some other aspects that play into why her escape potential is not as great as it could be, but we'll get to that in a bit. And then another thing that she's average at is 1v1s or boxing, especially in the early game when she doesn't have her full build potential, full skill potential yet. Clumsy said that in internal testing they ran her against Bellona and Osiris, and she was struggling to the point where she could hardly hold herself in lane basically before she got to the point where she could slowly start skilling up her abilities. Overall, I would say this depends heavily on the matchup. She has some very favorable matchups, but she also has some very, very unfavorable ones. And that brings us to her weak points or cons. The first one is that she kind of gets stuck on animations, not in a glitch way or something, but the moment you start up an ability, you will have to finish that ability before you can use the next one. So you will have to wait out the full animation, and if an ability is skilled up and has multiple strikes, you will have to wait out those multiple strikes. And that's where it kind of goes back to the escape potential, because if you are in one of your ability animations, then you can simply not use your escapes, because that ability has to finish first, and you cannot use your quick CC immunity that way either, which can be a big problem. You cannot even use relics, by the way. And I asked Clumsy about this, and this is actually intended design. This is so that she isn't too strong with attack cancelling, with Hydra's Lament, and in order to preserve that, basically, she takes that as a weak point. And you have to keep in mind that in this sense, it kind of means that skilling up the abilities can sometimes be dangerous for you, as funny as that sounds. You have an essentially stronger ability, but when you need to escape, it's actually worse. She also has multiple self-roots. On one hand, in her 3, when she is shooting the projectile, which actually takes quite a while until you get to the point of CC immunity. And on the other hand, in her ultimate, if she uses her ultimate and she hits a target, then she uses the knock-up and the arrow afterwards and is self-rooted for the entire duration. So if the enemy is a Poseidon, they will just blow you up while you're standing there if you haven't built sufficient defense. That means while her ultimate is very strong on paper in terms of raw damage numbers, the delay can make it very, very dangerous depending on how you're building. And that's why some players really dislike the ultimate, as strong as it sounds, because you are in this position where if you build full damage, the enemy team will just punish you for it. And that's why I think full damage builds are generally super high risk on her, and typically not what you will see being built. Typically, she's kind of forced to build a little bit more bruiser, a little bit more sustainy in order to be able to survive using her own ultimate or using her 3. She also has a lack of range. This will change slightly with the slow on the 2, that'll allow her to stick to enemies a little bit better, but overall she is a very close range character. And you notice that in fights as well, against characters that have to get close, like Hades for example, you can do relatively well, whereas against characters that can keep you at range easily, you'll struggle a lot more, especially in laning as well. If somebody has consistent high range poke and is able to avoid your 3, then you have almost no way to actually close the distance unless you want to sacrifice your ultimate for it in order to actually deal significant amounts of damage to them. And that's something that she will have to kind of play around, and players will have to learn to use that to their advantage to counter her. But it's definitely a weak point. She also requires long games to reach her full potential, especially when played as a jungler. And in game modes outside of Conquest, that means you'll sometimes also just not reach the late game potential with the maxed out skilled abilities, because you have to hit so many abilities for that to happen. Her leveling order currently gives her certain limitations, and that way also balances her. You want to level the 2 and the 1 early on basically. One is strong for the clear, the other one is for sustain, but both have another downside. Either you're going into sustain or you're going into more clear, and if you're deciding to go into more clear, for example, that means your sustain ability will be upgraded significantly later, and that also means that your boxing will be worse, because the upgrade, the upskilled 2, is the ability that does the most damage. So you want to invest into that, but if you invest into that, then you lack more clear than the other way around. So you kind of always have to make this trade-off decision every game, and I think we'll eventually find a meta where one of them is superior to the other, is considered superior. But until then, I think it's going to be a tough choice every game, and that is something that will hold her full potential back until mid-game at least. If you're playing as a jungler, she's also very blink reliant because, again, she needs to get close and you can't use the 3 for that because otherwise you like CC outside of the ultimate. Her siege potential is also somewhat limited in my opinion. She doesn't really come with any utility for her teammate, she doesn't come with any great tanking potential for towers. So when it comes to structures, she doesn't really do all that much. Sure, she can pull out enemies a little bit, but the range there isn't that far either. And now for some extra points that didn't really fit into the pros and cons structure. She definitely doesn't have the biggest 100 to 0 potential because she has relatively long animations on all of her abilities, and that means that she is just more of a bruiser overall, and I think that's fair enough. That's just how she's designed, and that is how she, in my opinion, works better. Even though pure jungler builds are numerically fine, I feel like the impact is often worse than that of a bruiser build and often is even less damage in the end because you have to play safer. Her damage currently might be above the point of balance, but it feels like that's somewhat offset by her lack of quick responses to situations due to being in those animations and not just being able to switch it up all the time. She is one of those cards where I definitely say she is easy to play, hard to master. Her base kit is very simple, but you can do a lot of, well, min-maxing with her and different skilling and all that kind of stuff that will have a major impact on how she performs, and you can itemize her in a lot of things as well. And overall, I would say, based on the impression that I have so far, she definitely feels like one of the more balanced releases. I could see some minor nerfs potentially to her damage output, to her early clear, but that's a question of getting more data on how she will perform in game, how she performs in different matchups, to see how the general player population feels about her across various levels of play as well. And until that data is there, I think she actually feels relatively balanced. Time Clumsy already said that if they're looking to nerf something, it would be the early game damage output of the 1 or the 2, if anything, because those are the ones where tweaks can be made very easily and where you can see that her balance could kind of hinge on that a little bit, and just a number shift in those could greatly impact her. They just want to make sure that they don't make her early game too weak in return for it. And it's going to be a struggle of some level at least to balance that between jungle and solo, because the clear may be stronger in one than the other. In my opinion, if she ends up overperforming across all levels, then it would likely be due to the 1, because that's the easy to hit ability. So that's the ability that should be looked at and potentially nerfed. But if she's only performing on higher levels of play, then the 2 should be looked at, because that's the one that is comparatively harder to hit, harder to execute, and a little bit harder to skill up as well. So that's something that will be seen more towards the higher levels of play. So I'm very happy with Mulan as a release so far. I'm really looking forward to her, and I don't expect her to be at least vastly over or underpowered at this point based on what I have seen so far on PTS. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and make the bell so you'll be updated for more Mulan info and other info. I'll also do a Mulan guide and all that stuff. And other than that, see you for the next one, probably tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.